Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second of the webinar on global analysis of policies to address oceanic plastic pollution. I'm Winnie Lau with the Preventing Ocean Plastics Project at the Pew Charitable Trusts. I have the honor of moderating this webinar today. In the next hour, we'll be sharing with you the findings and experts' reflections on the recently released report, 20 Years of Government Responses to the Global Plastic Pollution Problem. This work is a collaboration between the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University and the Pew Charitable Trusts. The impetus behind this work is to increase the evidence base on solutions for tackling the global plastic pollution problem. The Duke policy analysis is part of a larger Pew Preventing Ocean Plastics initiative and complements another soon-to-be-released report by Pew and the partner Systemic on a global scenario analysis of solutions to reduce ocean plastic pollution. The findings of both of these reports are feeding into a global plastic roadmap that will be released this summer. With that, please let me first acknowledge the Duke and Pew team that have helped put this webinar together. From Duke University's Nicholas Institute, we have Dr. John Virdin and Dr. Amy Pickle, who are the co-principal investigators of the research you'll be hearing about shortly, and Jeremy Ashton, the Senior Public Relations Specialist. From the Pew Charitable Trust, in addition to myself, we have Laura Margison, Director of Communications, and Brandon McGillis, Communications Officer, who's not with us tonight, but he was also instrumental in this webinar. So for the format for today, we'll begin with a 15-minute presentation by Dr. John Virdin, summarizing the key findings from the recently released report, followed by a 10-minute presentation by each of our two distinguished panelists. The first panelist is Dr. Karen Raubenheimer, lecturer at the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security at the University of Wollongong in Australia. Karen will be discussing the state of government responses to plastic pollution problem and future directions. Our second panelist is Ms. Tiza Mafira, Associate Director for Climate Policy Initiative and co-founder of the Indonesia Plastic Bag Diet Movement. Tiza will be speaking on the current policy landscape in Indonesia and share her thoughts on future priorities for Indonesia. After the panelist presentations, we'll have time for questions and answer. Please send us your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentations. During the Q&A portion at the end, I'll select some questions to pose to our speakers. And one housekeeping note, if you are having trouble with your video or audio during the webinar, this session is being recorded and will be available for viewing in the next couple of days. And with that, I will turn it over to John Virdin to present the policy report. John, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Winnie, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today, and it's a pleasure to join this distinguished panel. As Dr. Lau mentioned, I want to just walk through a little bit about the study that we just completed and to share with you some of the things that we found in hopes that they can be useful. I want to acknowledge first off, as you see here on this slide, basically that I am happily presenting on behalf of a large team of researchers that worked on this study. So I hope you see their names up there, but there was a large team from the Nicholas Institute at Duke, as well as Duke's Marine Lab. So it was a group effort. We also are very grateful to Dr. Raubenheimer for her feedback and comments on a draft of this. So it's really been the benefit of a lot of hands and a lot of work. But just to tell you quickly what it is that we were looking at, as Dr. Lau mentioned, this was an empirical analysis of how governments have responded around the world to the global plastic pollution problem over the last 20 years, from the beginning of the year 2000 to mid-2019. So of course, we didn't know at the time that would be in a sense, a baseline for a very different world that we're in now with a pandemic. But we do hope that even as policy responses are changing, we can even use this body of work, this inventory of policies as a baseline to compare what governments were doing even before and after this pandemic. And at the same time, in doing this, we've tried to take a bit of the state of the science on what we know is working and hasn't worked from government responses to the plastic pollution policy. All of this with the objective, as Dr. Lau mentioned, of helping us collectively better track and monitor progress towards solving this global problem, better track and monitor what governments are doing towards this. And particularly as governments are increasingly formulating new policies, hopefully this to provide a resource to governments on examples from what other countries, other governments have done that might help them design the policy responses that fit their context. So that was what we were looking at. I want to be clear what we actually focused on. When we say government responses to this problem, we were focusing on public policies at all levels: international agreements, regional agreements, national laws and regulations, local ordinances, local regulations, but those that were explicitly aiming to reduce plastic pollution, reduce leakage of plastic at some stage in the life cycle of all products. So I say that only to say that we all know from the science and the literature to date that solid waste management and sound solid waste management policies and infrastructure are fundamental to addressing plastic pollution. But we've considered those as these generally applicable waste management policies that essentially form the business as usual scenario or the baseline upon which these additional efforts by governments specifically to address plastic pollution would form. So, of course, governments are changing, updating, adjusting their waste management policies and efforts. But that is the business as usual scenario that we consider would be happening anyway in the absence of this global problem. And we've focused on this additional response, these policies that are explicitly aiming in some way to address the leakage of plastic at some stage in the life cycle of a given type of plastic or product. So that's the scope. That's what we looked at, sort of what we did, how we looked at it. There are a number of ways that people have been trying to get a synthesis, a summary, a view of globally how governments are responding. There have been some nice studies over the recent years where people have taken surveys of experts around the world in countries. Dr. Raubenheimer has a number of pieces looking at international agreements and the landscape of international policy. So we, just to add to that body, we tried to focus on global databases, these international repositories of global, regional, national treaties, laws that have been enacted to address plastic pollution, and then complement that with a pretty thorough review of all the different sources of the scientific literature, database of scientific literature, and legal scholarship, as well as sources of media, pulling through all of these different sources of information to compile two things that we've called a global plastics policy inventory, basically an inventory library of all the different policy documents that we could actually find at all levels, as well as an inventory of the scientific literature of studies that have been trying to measure in some way, shape, or form what has worked and what hasn't worked from these policies. So that was how we thought we would look at it. We wanted to try to form a systematic inventory or database of the different policies that governments have enacted at all levels. And we've then, to complement that, tried to form this library of the scientific studies and gray literature studies that have tried to measure what of these policies are working and what aren't. So I just want to give everybody a sense of sort of how we went about this. The result was we were able to form this global inventory as, you know, as we say, as a start, as a beginning, something that we hope to keep living, expand, build upon, but to give us a sense of how governments are responding. And we did just kind of a quick measure of how complete we thought this might be. So what we did is there are a number of studies, reports, even press releases, media feeds that might reference the existence or passage of a policy. You might see a news release, something in the paper saying this country or this government has just passed a policy on plastic bottles, but we go underneath that, we can't actually find the policy, we can't find any evidence of that, we can't actually locate the law that was passed behind that, but we know there's this reference there. So we cataloged all these references and then saw from those how many we were actually able to find, the policy documents themselves, to build in this inventory. At the international level, we feel like it's a pretty complete inventory. We have almost all of the policies that we found references to, 97%. At the national level, we know it's incomplete. We feel like it's hopefully indicative of how governments are responding to the problem at the national level. Somewhere between 40 to 50% roughly of the policies referred to somewhere in some report, press release, or study we've been able to find. At the local level, the subnational level, we've only begun to scratch the surface. Much harder to find some of these ordinances, local policies. What we have is just scattered examples at best. So it's really just the beginning. But in the end, we have what we hope is a significant growing body of plastics policy that people can search, people can look through to start to track what governments are doing at different levels. And when we did that, when we opened up all of these policy documents in this inventory and started to study them to see exactly how governments were responding to the problem, what plastics they were tackling, what instruments they were using, were they trying to address these problems with a tax, with a ban, with information campaigns. What we saw looking through that is, at first off, what is probably intuitive, but there has definitely been at every level a clear upward trend in the number of policy responses from governments to this problem over the last decade. Certainly, whether they're working or not, that's a separate question. But in terms of governments passing new policies to try to address this problem, we've seen a clear upward trend over the last decade. And we've particularly marked, the Honolulu strategy as an international agreement that was likely to be potentially a driver, a pivotal in increasing responses. But the number of total responses at all levels and what we've seen has been increasing steadily over the last decade, and particularly at the national level. At the national level, it was interesting to see this upward trend was largely driven by national responses to plastic bags over the last 10 decades. So that's where we see the big increase in the number of policies, are more and more governments specifically focusing in on plastic bags. And when they're doing that, their tool of choice has been a ban. There's a lot of literature discussion about what works best, a tax, a levy versus a ban, economic incentives or disincentives versus regulatory measures like a ban, information campaigns. But across all the policies, but particularly those targeting plastic bags, there was a trend, much more frequency of the use of bans in these documents, in these policies that we saw, and particularly on bags. And by mid-2019, when the end of the study period, we found that national governments had either banned, taxed, or levied fees on some form of plastic bag in at least 43 countries around the world, covering about 952 million people as of 2018. Or if the two policies in China and India are included, then of course that number bumps up to 3.7 billion people. But the number of policies at the national level, at least attempting to address plastic bags, has certainly grown as a main feature that stood out to us of this inventory. And interestingly, this growth and these number of policies has largely been a phenomenon of lower income countries to lower middle income countries. 33 out of the 43 countries that I mentioned were lower to lower middle income countries, particularly 33 out of those were in sub-Saharan Africa. So we definitely saw a focus, a geographic focus there. And in many of these countries, again, there seems to be a preference. The tool of choice was more a ban, which again, when you think about it, bans might be a little bit lower transaction cost to actually implement than, say, taxes and economic incentives. So it might be a more feasible tool for governments in a number of settings. One of the things that jumped out at us was interesting is that for all the growing number of responses, particularly focused on plastic bags, but even beyond that to single-use plastics, other macroplastics, very limited number of responses from national governments to microplastic pollution. These are still a recent phenomenon. We only found 9 national policies for targeting explicitly microplastics. 8 of those were within the last 5 years and largely in Europe and North America. So these still seem to be at the national level a relatively recent phenomenon. There's certainly international policies have been focused on microplastics a little bit longer. But one of the other interesting things that jumped out at us and starting to look at trends here was just in the in the geography of some of these national level responses. If you go back and you look at, for example, the paper by Professor Jambak and a number of co-authors in 2015 that modeled mismanaged plastic waste from coastal areas from different countries around the world, they have a list of the top 20 plastic polluting countries from their model. And then you look at that, you compare that list to where we have some form of national level policy in our inventory, we found that 7 of those 20 countries, we couldn't find any national policy trying to address plastic pollution in some form. And another 4 did have something, but it was only focused on plastic bags more narrowly. Now that doesn't mean these countries don't have a response. Some may, all may, we just couldn't find it. And of course, even if you have a response, that doesn't mean it's effective. But it was interesting for us to start to think that there may be a number of these potentially key polluting coastal countries that have yet to take a significant policy response to this problem at the national level. When we focused on the state of the science on what has worked and what hasn't, and looked at this library here, first off, it definitely seems to be a clear research gap. There's been very little dedicated study in science on observing the effects of these policies, which is probably not surprising given that so many of them are recent, and the average lag time we found between when a policy was enacted and when a study on it was published was about 6.5 years. But it is, of course, growing, and so this is hopefully a gap that's going to continue to be filled more and more, so we can all learn a little bit more about exactly what is working best in different contexts when governments respond to this policy. Far and away, the scientific literature on what's working and what isn't amongst plastic policies is again focused on bag policies. That was about 82% of the studies that we found. So far and away, the large majority, most of this literature, most of this research is focused on what's working in plastic bag policies, a little bit to a lesser extent plastic bottles. And amongst that literature, one thing that was interesting is that while it varies, and few of these studies use the type of methods we might think of for evidence-based policy making, looking at treatments and controls and causal inference methods. Across the board, all of them found at least short-term, sort of before and after changes, decreases in plastic bag consumption. I mean, these ranged anywhere from the mid 20 to 30% reduction to as high as 80 to 90% reduction. But they consistently showed some significant reduction in plastic bag consumption before and after the introduction of the policy in the short term. Now, that doesn't mean that some of these, they also consistently showed some unintended consequences, demand for these types of bags shifting into other non-reusable bags, paper bags, plastic garbage bags. But in terms of the focus, they did show a significant reduction. So that was at least one of the few consistent findings that we saw from this literature on what was working and what wasn't. So just to close from this, one of the things that we last thought might be useful is from the scientific literature that we tried to harvest and pull together, and we had across all of these databases, I think we looked at about 13,000 returns from searches to screen those down into a more manageable number of studies that were actually talking about plastic policy in some way, less than 200. And from those, we tried to see what were some consistent recommendations that experts and researchers and scientists were making to policymakers for forming better policy responses to plastic pollution. One of the interesting and consistent recommendations, and it was surprising how little we found this done in the inventory and the responses to date, is a use of information instruments, education awareness campaigns to accompany any of these policies. That policies were likely to be far more effective when the government made a concerted push to conduct education, awareness raising, information campaigns to accompany any type of measure, ban, tax, what have you, that the government was taking on a given plastic pollutant. And this was not happening as much as we expected to find in our inventory. I mentioned this before, and it's a consistent recommendation. Obviously, improved solid waste management is considered sort of a fundamental building block of national, local responses to plastic pollution. And that still remains the case throughout all of much of the literature that we saw. There's a large body of recommendations and observations just focused on plastic bags, and I've touched on that briefly, but there is a lot, I think, to learn there. And there were a number of scientists that said, some of these lessons can be extended to other single-use plastics, like the fact that the prevalence of regulatory bans could be a useful and quick response to some of these single-use plastic pollutants, at least in the short term, until alternatives are developed or until there's capacity for more complex policy responses. There was interestingly some optimism and suggestion that regulatory bans of plastic microbeads and all types of cosmetic and personal care products not only could be effective, but could be politically feasible over the coming years, and this could be, there are alternatives that exist, and this should be sort of a low-hanging fruit, so to speak, for governments. And then lastly, and Dr. Raubenheimer can talk far more knowledgeably about this than I can, but there was a very consistent and frequent recommendation for the need for a more coordinated global approach to addressing this problem, even though the contributions might be different from different countries, and the need for a global treaty with global binding and measurable targets for plastic pollution reduction, something that's currently missing from a lot of from international policy that we saw. So I will stop there and look forward to passing over to the panelists, but I just want to share some of the highlights of what we've seen so far.
Thank you so much, John. The work you and your team have done just represent an incredible goldmine of information. And it's really encouraging to see the increasing efforts by governments at all levels, as well as the kind of evolving diversity of instruments. So it'll be really interesting to see where we go from here. Our next speaker is Karen Raubenheimer. Karen, you've written a lot on this topic, on plastic policies. With your deep knowledge, can you share your thoughts on the state of government policy responses that John and his team have found, and where do you think governments will go from here? Karen.
Yeah, thanks for that, and good day to everyone. Just firstly, congratulations. I think this report is something we often talk about and we often try to express, but it really helps us to have a report that shows it in very concrete ways, is what governments are doing and where the focus of action is. So as the report highlighted, I mean, governments act at 3 levels, within the global community, at the regional level, and then obviously at the national and subnational levels. So what we're seeing at the global level, as John mentioned, is an increase in the debate around the need for a new global framework, be that a binding agreement or a voluntary framework. So there's also an increase in call from countries for an international legally binding agreement, which I found quite interesting because we don't actually know what that looks like yet. So for countries to actually stand up and say that they want this is an interesting progression. We started at back in UNEA 3 in 2017, looking at what that could look like, but it was a very high level look at a global agreement. Now what we're seeing is the Nordic countries are taking that conversation further, and we're starting to look at a more in-depth conversation of what that legally binding agreement could look like. And that will probably then lead to a discussion on whether we need a legally binding agreement or whether a voluntary framework would work. And that's still a question some countries are posing at this stage, and others are sitting on the fence until they can see some more concrete views of what this could look like. So it's an important piece of work that's happening at the global level, and there's a lot of contributions from countries and a lot of interest in this discussion. So that's been an interesting progression there. And then at the regional level, we know countries continue to work together with the regional seas programs and in other regional economic fora to develop action plans on marine litter. They're making good progress in this, but also good progress more at the monitoring of marine litter, with some development of indicators and then some actions to try and move upstream, but it's probably not really within the mandate of the regional seas programs to do that. So I think there's limitations on how far they can go with that. Even so, there still remain some difficulties in tracking progress at this level. So the regional level is important, and it's important that countries continue to engage at that, but I think there are limitations to that approach. Also of note is the Pacific region, which is coming together quite well, and they're considering a regionally binding agreement on plastics, but that's also at the very, very early stages and just as a concept at this point. And then lastly, as we know, countries act at the national and subnational level, and this is really where all the action takes place and the implementation. And I think this is where the report has been particularly helpful, because it's shown where that action is being focused, and a lot of it, as John said, is on the bans of plastic bags, etc. And bans, as he said, are sort of a quick short-term action, and we will eventually reach a point where we can't ban anymore. So it's not really a long-term solution. But I think what we're seeing here is that a difference in countries that are at the opposite ends of the plastics management spectrum. So the report has highlighted some of the most common activities, but we're seeing some more progressive themes coming through as well, which are heading in the right direction. But I guess their success, as always, lies in their design, how they're implemented, and obviously enforcement. So if you're looking at the plastic waste management, which is the end of life process, some countries are quite mature in their waste management policies. So we're seeing that they still struggle with textiles or fishing gear or agriculture or construction and demolition. So these countries are now starting to target these types of waste streams in more depth, as well as microplastics. But as we've heard, it's still very difficult. Governments are hesitant to actually regulate on microplastics other than microbeads, because they feel like they need more research into the pathways and the solutions. So some of the regional seas programs are helping with that kind of research. Then we see countries which are probably at the other end of the waste spectrum, and they're struggling with the types of waste that they have on their markets and how to deal with them. So where we see countries at the first end of the spectrum that are more mature, they have implemented in the past some waste to energy facilities as a component of their solutions, but now they're heading towards issues where these incinerators are operating at below capacity because of the policies to reduce waste generation of plastics or policies to increase recycling. So this is taking away the feedstocks for these facilities. So I think we're reaching a point at where the policymakers are having to sort of try and balance out the long-term contracts of waste to energy facilities with their medium to long-term waste reduction strategies. So that's a new development there, but some of the countries that I mentioned that are at the opposite end of the spectrum, where they are not managing their waste, struggling to deal with that, they're looking at incineration as a sort of a quick fix almost, and that's something that they need to learn from, is balancing those those policies of waste reduction and improving the uptake of collection and recycling versus feeding these incineration plants. So what's also happening, as we know, is the discussion around EPR schemes, and some of the countries that are struggling with their waste management are really looking to EPR now to help draw industry into the solutions and fund their waste management. But it may take some time for this to implement, because mostly the infrastructure is not there for the collection, transport and sorting. So this still has to catch up before an EPR scheme can really be effective, I think. So in many of these countries, the EPR schemes would also need to consider the informal sector. So their design may be very different to those in the first group I mentioned, who are more mature in the EPR schemes, but there's also still a lot to learn. So overall, I think, you know, most countries are now talking about the circular economy or sustainable consumption and production, as well as extended producer responsibility. But a lot of it is still words in their legislation or in their strategies. It's how to implement this is where they are struggling. So this needs to be given effect in their policies now. But again, the interpretation of these approaches is very different, as I mentioned, and this obviously affects their implementation and outcomes, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But again, a new trend that's coming through is the increasing mention in roadmaps and action plans at the national level about national design standards. So this is an area which is also now at a very early stage, and we've yet to see what this could look like. So there's some interesting developments happening there. I think Canada has it in their roadmap. So we're starting to see a move upstream now, away from waste management of plastics through to the design now, and it's actually starting to take some language in policies and strategies too. So where is this all heading? As I said, I think we're starting to hear the right language now that we're moving away from thinking of it as a marine litter problem, or even simply as a waste management problem. So we're now talking about design, we're talking about policy as a whole a lot more, and this is where this type of research comes in a lot, because we've always pushed the research on the scientific agenda and not so much on the socioeconomic impacts and the policy impacts. So we're also talking about the benefits that it can bring to different parts of society, and then a range of market-based instruments beyond EPR that can help drive behavior change and better funding models. So we're really starting to get to the nuts and bolts of the 3 R's approach, or the 5 R's, whichever, how many R's you want in your policies. But we've talked about these things for a long time. So we're now really, I think, starting to get to the nuts and bolts of how we actually do that. So the one area I think the most useful approach is looking at this through the economic lens. And that's where I think this report brings out some of those incentives and disincentives and the taxes, etc. But to me, this is driven firstly by managing the design of products, which in turn will then drive some of the economics as well. So we'd like to see policy moving a little more in that direction. And I think we need to also investigate the full range of market-based instruments. It's not just EPR. So there's many other market-based instruments in place around the world, and we need to look deeper into how these really are effective at changing behavior. And when I say behavior, I don't necessarily mean you and me standing in the supermarket and making a choice based on a label, but really it's the collectors, retailers, etc., and looking at the quantity and the quality of the material placed on the market so that we can improve the supply and demand of products. So just to wrap up, I think, you know, we're moving in the right direction. The policies are there, but it's really about now how do we make it an economic solution as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Karen. You've given us a lot to think about. I mean, it's interesting to see the developments at the international level. Will be interesting to see what the Nordic countries come out with. And also thank you for sharing some of the challenges that countries are facing. And I think this will lead really well to the presentation next by our next speaker, Tiza Mafira. Tiza, you work on the front lines of this issue. I mean, Indonesia is one of the leaders in so many environmental problems, and leaders in tackling so many of the environmental problems. And as John said, the Duke analysis represents a sampling of policies at the subnational level. Can you share with us the policies in Indonesia that are dealing with the plastic pollution problem within the country? And what do you think are the future priorities? Over to you, Tiza.
Sure, thanks, Winnie. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate the scientists working on this publication at Duke University. Congratulate John for an excellent report. It's always great, as a person working on local policies, it's always great to see how, these policies are put into context against the global trends of policymaking around the world. I myself am a policy analyst by profession. I'm a lawyer by training, and I've, apart from working at a think tank, Climate Policy Initiative, but I've also worked on policy advocacy with an organization that I helped co-found 7 years ago, the Indonesia Plastic Bag Diet Movement. And for the past 7 years, what we've been doing is we've been pushing policies to reduce the usage of single-use plastic. And so we were, I think, key players pushing or behind the momentum for levies, plastic bag charge trials starting in 2016 in Indonesia, plastic tax being discussed at the moment at the Ministry of Finance, and about 20 plus cities in Indonesia implementing plastic bag bans. And so we're slightly responsible for that disproportionate amount of plastic bag bans that you've highlighted in your report compared to other types of policies. But I think I can use this opportunity to explain kind of the thinking behind these, the popular choice of plastic bag bans, and actually where it sits in the bigger context of waste management. So I'll start with that, yeah? I'll start with the reason why I think plastic bag bans are popular. It's actually now becoming increasingly common knowledge that recycling isn't working. So if globally recycling is only happening at less than 10% of total plastics, then we can say that it's not successful. And the reason for the failure, not just in developing countries, but also in developed countries, the reason for the failure of recycling is because, first of all, there's way too many types of plastics being produced at the moment. So if you're a waste sorter, or if you're a machine that sorts waste, you're basically trying to sort 52 to 70 types of plastics, and it's not possible. And the second reason is that a lot of these plastics are just too low in quality to be recycled at an economic scale. And so lots of different types of plastics are basically clogging the system. And what we want is for policies that require producers to redesign plastics so that they are easier to recycle, have a higher value to be recycled economically, and second, have higher recycled content in the objects that they produce, in the packaging that they produce, in order to create a demand for recycled plastic in the first place. So right now there's very, very little demand for recycled plastic pellets because virgin plastic pellets are way, way cheaper, and there's no way that recycled plastic pellets can compete unless we create this kind of artificial demand for it. And so when we're thinking of, if our goal is to redesign all these plastics so they all can be recycled, they can all contribute to a circular economy where all these resources get recycled, not just once, but time and continuously for as many times, many cycles as possible, that means that certain types of plastics need to be phased out because they no longer fit within this circular system. And these types of plastics are, well, the low quality ones. Plastic bags are one of those. And of course there are others. There's straws, for example, or polystyrene as another example. Sachets, which is very, very a big problem in developing countries like Indonesia, is another problem. But there's something about plastic bags. It's a non-essential product. It's not something that that we realize we don't actually need. There's no brand ownership over a single plastic bag. And it's as John mentioned, it's cheap to implement. So for a state budget or a subnational budget perspective, it's the easier choice apart from other compared to other policies. It's also a behavioral change type policy. So most of these, or at least in Indonesia, the plastic bag bans are not aimed at stopping the production of plastic bags, but at stopping the consumption of plastic bags. So it's aimed at giving a nudge. When you don't provide plastic bags, you're giving a nudge to consumers to change their behavior, which is to carry their own bags, start using reusables. And that's kind of an important stepping stone for the next kind of policies that we want, which is to push for more reusables, push for more refillables, push for a system of delivery of goods that utilizes more of these kinds of reusable, refillable systems instead of single-use systems. So what I'd like to highlight here as well is that it's from the experience that I've had with working on the design of some of these policies. It's not just complex to determine the object that's being regulated. I mean, there's multiple types of plastics, but even a single type of plastic, like a plastic bag, needed multiple iterations in order to get like a clear definition of what we mean by a single plastic bag. It was complicated to define, but it was also not exactly easy to determine who was the party to be regulated. And in this case, in the case of plastic bags, it was the retailers, but there was a lot of discussion. Should we regulate the production? Should we regulate the consumers? Should we fine consumers if we find them carrying bags? Should we what? So there was a lot of discussion around that. And that's because the supply chain of plastic is very, very long. And and that's a segue for me to explain some of the other policies that the Indonesian government has adopted with regard to reducing plastic, preventing the use of plastic. So this is very much an upstream policy. It's aimed at preventing plastic from being wasted in the first place. And there's three different, you mentioned bans and levies. I'll add another one, which is redesign. And the Indonesian government has enacted a law that targets both redesign bans and levies. And the redesign one is a pretty recent one. It was just enacted last year. And what it does is it targets fast-moving consumer goods, hotels, restaurants, service industries, and it also targets retailers. And for the redesign, what it says is that you, as a fast-moving consumer good, you're not allowed to create a packaging that's lesser than 500 milliliters or 200 milliliters, depending on the type of product. And I think what that aims to do is to say you can't produce sachets or like tiny, minuscule little packages that won't have a value to recycle. The other kind of redesign regulations rules that are in that regulation is you can't place a label on your packaging. So this is a problem a lot with PET bottles. PET bottles are entirely recyclable. They have a high recycling rate, but their labels aren't because it's made of a lower kind of quality. So what the government regulation says is you have to emboss your label onto the body of the bottle instead of stick it on. And that is aimed at improving the chances for every single part of that packaging to be recycled. So these kinds of things, and then plus banning certain kinds of single-use plastics that are just hopeless. And then there's another kind of levy being designed right now by the Ministry of Finance that's supposed to have a national scope. But I'd like to highlight that that's three different kind of subjects or who. The who that's being targeted in those regulations are fast-moving consumer goods, hotels, restaurants, retailers. It's the consumption industry. And it does still miss out on targeting plastic production. And any kind of policy in the world that might have already targeted plastic production still hasn't linked it to the production of the raw material that produces plastic, which is oil. And so we need to remember that the supply chain of plastic doesn't begin with plastic itself, but it begins with the raw material, which is oil. And at the moment when oil prices are low, economies are shifting to renewables. The hedging strategy for the oil industry is to put all their oil into petrochemicals, which is into plastic. And so the trend, the estimated trend is to see a lot more cheap plastics being produced regardless of the demand. And so I'll stop there for the time being to just wrap up and say that there are logic. There's a particular logic behind the choice of a plastic bag ban. I think it's easier and it's low-hanging fruit. But there is still a lot to be done, and we need to look at the problem as a systemic problem that goes throughout the supply chain and targets specific policies in every phase of the supply chain. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiza. It's really fascinating to hear the reasoning behind, why bans are so prevalent. But you really raised some good points about looking at the entire value chain, entire supply chain, as a lot of the policies in place right now focus on the back end, the post-consumer end. So thank you for raising the need for more pre-consumer upstream solutions. So thank you again to our three speakers for really insightful presentations and discussions. And to me, it's very heartening to see that the trends are going in the right direction to solving this environmental problem. And I think our audience agrees, because we have been getting many questions. So thank you so much for being so engaged to the audience. So with that, I will pull out some questions that I'll be posing to our panelists. The first one, I will direct it to John to see if you can reflect a little bit on how we define when a policy is working. I mean, obviously, you were not able to find that many scientific articles documenting effectiveness, but how do we, as a community, go forward in assessing effectiveness of policies?
Sure, and the short answer on this, Winnie, is that for the purposes of this study, we've defined effectiveness as the degree to which the policy is achieving its goal or its objective. So it's set by these policies, and scientists, researchers are looking at to what extent did it achieve its goals. So that's a very different. That's very different from all the international community collectively setting a target, for setting a goal, and seeing how effective these policies are moving us towards like a shared goal for plastic pollution reduction. These are, and in that sense, we weren't as researchers defining that goal, that measure of effectiveness. We were just looking at measures of how much or little the policies achieve the goals that they set in their context.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So I think from in international perspective, Karen, what do you think we need to do in order to ensure that whatever is happening at the international level can be effective or will be effective in light of what has been discussed so far?
Webinar 101, unmute yourself. So to me, it's you've got to really think about the question, what is possible at the international level, which is a very different thing to what is possible at the national level when it comes to regulation. So the part of the problem here is that the value chain is global, and I think that's where we need to step in at the global level. There's a lot of small developing countries who struggle to regulate what comes on their market, and that's where they want the help. They don't have the capacity, there's not the people in their departments to work on this type of thing. So everybody needs that help. We've got issues with the WTO if we don't tackle this from a global level. So I think we need to look at the strengths of what we can do at the global level and what we need there versus what, like an EPR scheme at a national level. But we can certainly try and provide the tools at the global level to enable those types of policies to be implemented in different countries in whatever context suits them. So that's, I think, one of the angles we need to come from at the global level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Tiza, I'm going to go to you, and get to the country level and whether you're seeing policies at the subnational level and at the national level that might be connected to what is happening at the international level.
Yeah, I mean, in the subnational level, plastic bag bans are very popular, but the national level policies are focused more on providing roadmaps for various actors, not just subnational governments, but also, industries, multiple stakeholders. One of them is the National Plastic Action Partnership that Indonesia is a part of. It's part of the Global Plastic Action Partnership that aims to pull these stakeholders together and create like a common baseline, a common roadmap. And Indonesia has announced various commitments to reduce 70% of plastic marine debris by 2025. And a lot of those targets have actually been translated into regulatory roadmaps that subnational governments are required to comply with. And so there's a subnational chapter of these roadmaps with their own specific reduction targets in percentages. So that's happening, and I think that is happening in the right direction in the sense that it's comprehensive. It does tackle a variety of waste, not just plastic, but the waste system as a whole. It tackles reduction and handling of waste post facto, so waste after a certain good becomes waste, that's handling, but preventing a good from becoming waste, that's reduction. So it tackles both reduction and handling. But I do think that sometimes there's at a political discourse level, there's a little bit too much emphasis being placed on waste handling. And so that's why we have government-sponsored cleanups, beach cleanups, or we have discussions on how to attract investment for incineration, which I think should be less of a priority, and that tackling prevention should be more of a priority.
Great, thank you. So both you, Tiza, and Karen have brought up, in engagement of other stakeholders and sectors. I mean, Tiza, you work for an NGO. Karen, you brought up the point about more economic financial instruments and incentives. How do you think these other groups, such as industry and NGO, can engage in this debate and help raise the ambition of policies to deal with the plastic pollution problem? We'll start with Tiza.
Okay, sure. I think it's very important to have industries participate in providing these solutions. for a number of reasons. Number one is that they're responsible for these pollutions. That's why we have the concept known as extended producer responsibility, that's making its rounds around the world. That's because I think there's a general consensus that producers of this of the goods that eventually become waste should be more responsible, should take it back should put funds into processing that waste, and not have it as an external cost as it has been all this time. But also, I think there needs to be a deeper understanding, as I mentioned earlier, of the different kinds of industries that we're talking about, because the supply chain is very, very long. In my view, the lower the supply chain, the better their reactions and responses have been so far. And the more downstream you get in like the typologies of industries involved, the better their responses so far, and the higher the supply chain, not so much. So I think that we now need to kind of gradually shift attention to the higher up upstream players, because that's kind of the root cause. Just to add one more thing with regards to industries, I wanted to give a shout out to local businesses, small enterprises. They are doing a lot of innovative things, and at much more innovative than entrenched big multinational companies. And I think there's an argument to be made to support shorter supply chains in general, and they've been at the forefront of creating solutions that don't rely on plastic.
Great, thank you. Karen, what do you think?
So I think NGOs play an important role, particularly some who've come up with apps and different ways of looking at the problem. For instance, some of the transport issues, the first line of transport is the collection point, and a lot of NGOs have come up with apps and different things to help informal waste sectors. It's those types of thinking that we need to really bring up to the national level and try and bring up to the international level. But when we talk about market-based instruments, what I'm trying to say is that we need to look at it outside of just plastic waste. There's a whole waste stream, and there's a whole value chain, as we know. And there's various entry points for these market-based instruments along that, from the very first manufacturer who puts something on the market right through to the landfill operator. So there's entry points here where we can extract money, if you want to call it, or where we can incentivize different behavior. And it includes transport. So if we're doing things like reverse logistics or backloading, there's tax incentives we can give there. So maybe a tax reduction instead of taxing the bad, we can tax less on the good. And that goes to differential taxes as well, based on your product design. So I think the NGOs and industry can start looking more at the value chain, looking outside of just how do we pay for collection and recycling, but the transport, particularly in developing countries or island states where it's very remote, it's very expensive to transport your waste back. How do we get that waste back to a central point where we can make it economically feasible to collect it and potentially exported under the Basel Convention? So we need to start thinking about these things holistically, putting in landfill taxes, other things to try and push things back on the market so that there's there's a scale that makes it worthwhile. So it's really looking at all those little pieces of the puzzle, and where can we firstly extract money to help fund, and I'd never say that any manufacturer must pay for the total cost of collection. You contribute, almost subsidizing these processes so that they're immune to market impacts and shocks and things like that. So we try and really, as we always say, decouple all this whole process from the cost of fossil fuels and et cetera, et cetera. So we try and make an independent system that is self-funded in a way, but everyone contributing down to the consumer as well. We can't keep pushing everything back on the manufacturer. Everyone plays a role in this, but it does rely on a good design in the first place, so that we're cleaning up that circle in the beginning, and probably reducing our residual waste along the way.
Thank you so much, Karen. I think that's a great place to end, as our hour is up. I think the key message I got there is everybody has a role to play. All the stakeholders need to be involved and engaged. So thank you so much, everyone, for this fascinating discussion. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. And I'd like to say thank you to our panelists again for sharing their time and knowledge. If you are interested in the report, in the chat box, you'll find links to the report, as well as the policy inventory and the Pew work. Please feel free to reach out to any of us if you would like to have a deeper discussion. There were many more questions than we had time for, so please do reach out to us. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day or evening. Thank you again, and bye-bye.